You don't get flagged by a secure military grid unless you're either a threat or a ghost they forgot to erase. The warning tone was soft, almost polite, but it cut clean through the dry Texas air as a red indicator blinked to life on the perimeter console, drawing a sharp glance from Lieutenant Daniel Carter, who stood beneath the steel awning of Access Point Delta, a restricted sector buried deep inside Fort Ridgeline, where even most officers never set foot, and yet there he was, watching an old man walk calmly toward the checkpoint like he had nowhere else to be. No hesitation in his step, no glance at the armed guards flanking the gate. Just a steady pace across the gravel that crunched under worn boots, as if the years hadn't touched him the way they clearly had. His denim jacket faded, his posture slightly bent, but his eyes, those pale, quiet eyes, didn't belong to someone lost. They belonged to someone who had already been here before any of this existed, and Carter felt it, that faint irritation rising as he stepped forward, one hand resting near his sidearm, not out of fear, but authority. The kind that came easy to a man who trusted systems more than stories. "Sir, this is a restricted access zone," he called out, voice sharp, rehearsed, carrying just enough edge to establish control without escalation. But the old man didn't stop immediately, not out of defiance, more like he was finishing a thought. Then he slowed, lifted his gaze to the gate scanner humming beside Carter, and said nothing. Just stood there in the dust and silence while the system behind them pinged again. Unauthorized presence. Carter exhaled through his nose, already losing patience. "I'm going to need ID or clearance credentials," he added, firmer now, stepping closer until he could see the fine lines on the man's face, the sun-worn skin, the faint scar near his jaw, details that meant nothing in a database and everything in a life lived somewhere else. Somewhere far removed from digital clearance levels and biometric scans. "You can't just walk into a classified grid because you feel like it," Carter said, a hint of a smirk forming as he gestured toward the terminal. "You're not in the system." And that's when the old man finally spoke, voice low, steady, like gravel under slow-moving tires. "That system exists because of me." No anger, no challenge. Just a statement dropped into the space between them that didn't try to prove anything and didn't need to. Carter let out a short breath, almost a laugh, shaking his head as he reached for the tablet, ready to scan, dismiss, move on. Because men like this showed up every now and then, veterans with stories, ghosts with names. Nobody could verify, and the system always had the final word. Always, at least that's what Carter believed as the scanner flickered again, red against steel, while somewhere deep in the command building a second alert quietly came to life, unnoticed by most, but not by all. Lieutenant Carter held the tablet out between them like a verdict already decided, the screen glowing faint blue against the midday glare as he tapped through layers of authorization menus with the casual confidence of someone who had never seen the system fail, his thumb steady, precise, every motion practiced, efficient, while the old man did not move, did not shift his weight. Did not even glance at the device that was supposed to define whether he existed here or not. Instead, his attention drifted past Carter's shoulder toward the reinforced fencing, the sensor towers rising every 50 yards, the subtle hum of surveillance equipment woven into the air like a second atmosphere. And for a brief moment, there was something almost familiar in the way his eyes traced the layout, like he was not seeing it for the first time, but remembering it differently, before it had steel and code and authorization layers, when it had only been lines drawn on paper and decisions made under pressure. Carter cleared his throat, sharper this time, breaking that quiet observation. "Name," he said, not as a question but a command, already preparing to input it into the system that would either validate or dismiss the man in front of him. The old man turned his head slightly, just enough for the light to catch the pale blue in his eyes, and answered without hesitation, "Robert Hayes." The name landed softly, without wait. Just another entry to be checked. Carter typed it in, waited half a second, frowned as the system returned nothing, not even a partial match, just a blank response that triggered a small notification in the corner of the screen, unrecognized identity. He tilted the tablet slightly, as if a different angle might change the outcome, then let out a quiet breath through his nose. "Yeah, that tracks," he muttered, not even trying to hide the dismissal anymore. No clearance, no record, no Authorization. He lowered the tablet and met Hayes's gaze again. Which means you are in the wrong place. There was a pause, not long, but long enough for the wind to shift, carrying a dry gust across the gravel that lifted the edge of Hayes's jacket and revealed something tucked beneath it. Not a weapon, not anything threatening, just a folded piece of paper, old, worn at the edges. The kind of thing that had been carried for years rather than printed that morning. Carter noticed it. Immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as he nodded toward it. "What is that?" he asked, more out of curiosity now than procedure. Hayes followed his gaze, then reached slowly into his jacket, his movements deliberate, unhurried, as if time moved differently for him, and pulled out the folded map, holding it carefully, almost respectfully, before extending it forward just enough for Carter to see without fully handing it over. The paper was creased, the ink faded in places, but the lines were still there, precise, intentional, a layout that looked strangely familiar even at a glance. Carter stepped closer, leaning in slightly, the faint scent of dust and aged paper cutting through the sterile air around the checkpoint. He gave a short, incredulous chuckle. "You brought a paper map to a classified digital grid," he said, shaking his head. "That is not how this works anymore." And without asking, he reached out and took the edge of it between his fingers, not roughly, but without permission either, lifting it just enough to get a better look. And that was when the subtle shift happened, not in the environment, not in the system, but in Hayes himself, something almost imperceptible, a tightening. In the stillness, as Carter's eyes moved across the markings, the hand-drawn notations, the coordinates written in a style that did not match any modern standard, his smirk fading just slightly as recognition tried to surface and failed. "Where did you even get this?" he asked, quieter now, less certain, while behind them, inside the command building, a secondary alert escalated from silent to priority. A small detail on a screen that most would ignore, but one that caused a single officer to stop mid-step, turn back, and look again, this time more carefully. Carter's fingers lingered on the edge of the map a fraction longer than necessary, not because he respected it, but because something about it refused to fit neatly into the category of nonsense he had already assigned to the man holding it. The paper felt different, heavier than it should have been, as if it carried more than just lines and ink. And when he unfolded it further, the creases opened like a memory being forced back into daylight, revealing a full layout that made his expression tighten almost imperceptibly. The geometry was wrong for a modern schematic, too organic, too intuitive, lines bending around terrain instead of cutting through it, annotations written by hand instead of printed, arrows that suggested movement rather than structure. And then there were the markings, small symbols scattered across the page that did not match any current military legend but still felt deliberate, precise. Carter leaned in closer, scanning it as if he could brute force recognition. Through logic alone. "This is outdated," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "This facility does not even use this configuration." He pointed to a section near the center. "There is nothing here anymore." But Hayes did not respond immediately, his gaze resting not on Carter but on the map itself, like he was looking through it instead of at it. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same quiet weight. "There was," he said simply, and for a brief second, Carter felt the faintest crack in his own confidence, not enough to admit doubt, but enough to shift his stance, enough to make him glance. Back at the actual facility behind him, the reinforced structures, the antenna arrays, the hardened access points that all aligned perfectly with the digital blueprint in his system, and yet, when he looked back down at the paper, there was an unsettling overlap, subtle but real, as if the old lines had been buried beneath the new ones rather than replaced entirely. He exhaled slowly, irritation returning as a defense against that unease. "Listen," he said, folding part of the map back down with a controlled motion. "Whatever you think this is, it does not give you access." His tone sharpened again, reclaiming authority. "You are not authorized, you are not in the system. And this," he lifted the map slightly, "does not override protocol." But before he could push further, a voice came through the small comm unit clipped to his shoulder, low at first, almost drowned out by the ambient noise of the checkpoint. "Lieutenant Carter, confirm status at access point Delta." Carter straightened, instinctively, pressing a finger to the device. Routine. Unauthorized civilian. No clearance. Preparing removal. There was a pause on the other end, longer than it should have been for such a simple report. Then the voice returned, tighter now. Stand by. Carter frowned slightly, pulling his hand away, the delay irritating him more than the situation itself. He glanced back at Hayes, who had not moved, not even when the call came through, as if he had heard it 100 times before, as if none of this was new to him. And that was when something else caught Carter's attention, a small detail he had missed before. In the lower corner of the map, partially hidden by a crease, there was a set of coordinates, not printed, but written in a steady, deliberate hand, followed by a short label that had faded but not disappeared. Carter shifted the paper slightly to read it more clearly, and as the words came into focus, his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to register, enough to slow his breathing by a fraction, because the label did not belong to history the way the rest of the map did. It belonged to the present. It matched a designation currently active inside the base. One that was not public, one that should not have been on a piece of paper that looked decades old. And before he could process that contradiction fully, the comm unit crackled again, louder this time, more urgent. Lieutenant Carter, do not proceed. Repeat, do not proceed. Maintain position. The shift in tone was unmistakable, no longer routine, no longer casual. And for the first time since the old man had stepped into view, Carter hesitated. The silence that followed the order was heavier than any raised voice, and Lieutenant Carter felt it settle over the checkpoint like a pressure he could not quite explain, his grip on the map tightening slightly as the words from the comm unit echoed in his mind. Do not proceed. It was not a suggestion, not a routine pause. It was a command that carried weight from somewhere higher than his immediate chain, and that alone was enough to shift the ground beneath his certainty. He lifted the device back to his shoulder, his voice controlled but edged with confusion. Command, clarify. This individual is unauthorized and currently within restricted proximity. There was another pause, shorter this time but sharper, like whoever was on the other end was choosing their words carefully. Lieutenant, maintain visual. Do not remove him. Do not escalate. Stand by for further instruction. Carter lowered his hand slowly, his eyes drifting back to Hayes, who had not reacted at all to the change in tone. No sign of relief, no sign of tension, just that same still presence, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment without needing to check a clock. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint hum from the distant structures inside the facility, a sound Carter had heard 1,000 times without ever really noticing. But now it seemed louder, more present, like the entire base had leaned in just slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to reassert control over a situation that no longer felt entirely his. Looks like you just bought yourself a delay, he said, though the confidence in his voice did not land the way it had before. Hayes glanced at him briefly, not dismissive, not impressed, just aware. Then his gaze returned to the map, still partially held between them. And for a moment Carter followed that gaze, seeing the paper not as an inconvenience, but as a problem he did not yet understand. His eyes drifted back to the coordinates in the corner, the label that should not have existed outside secure systems, and a question began to form before he could stop it. How do you have that? He asked, quieter now, less accusation and more genuine uncertainty. Hayes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached forward and gently took the map back, folding it with careful precision along the same worn lines, each crease falling exactly where it had countless times before, and only when it was secured in his hand did he speak. Because I was there before it needed a name. The words were simple, but they carried something Carter could not categorize, not arrogance, not nostalgia, something deeper, something that made the digital certainty in his tablet feel suddenly incomplete. Behind them, the checkpoint monitors flickered as a secondary feed opened without manual input, a secure channel overriding the standard interface. One of the guards shifted uneasily, glancing between the screen and Carter, unsure whether to speak. The image stabilized into a live internal camera view from deep within the command building, a corridor Carter recognized but had never entered, reserved for clearance levels far above his own. And in that corridor a figure moved quickly, uniform crisp, posture urgent, not running but moving with purpose that bordered on it. Carter felt a tightness in his chest he had not expected, not fear, but the realization that whatever this situation was, it had already moved beyond him. The comm unit crackled again, this time with a different voice, older, steadier, carrying the kind of authority that did not need to raise volume to be heard. Lieutenant Carter. The name was spoken clearly, deliberately. You will remain at your position and ensure that Mr. Hayes is not obstructed. Carter's jaw tightened slightly, the wording precise, not escorted, not detained, not questioned, not obstructed. He glanced at Hayes again, seeing him differently now, not as a civilian out of place, but as a variable the system itself was adjusting around. And for the first time since this began, Carter did not speak immediately, because he no longer knew which rule applied. The shift in authority did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It arrived in the way every person at the checkpoint suddenly became aware of something larger than their own role, a quiet recalibration that started in the monitors and moved outward, visible in the way the guards straightened without being told, in the way Lieutenant Carter lowered his tablet just slightly without realizing he had done it, and in the way the air itself seemed to tighten as the secure feed continued to stream. From deep inside the command building, the figure on the screen moving through controlled doors that opened before he reached them, each one requiring a level of clearance Carter knew he did not possess. And yet here it was, broadcast directly onto his station without explanation, as if the system had decided he needed to see it whether he understood it or not. Carter swallowed once, steadying his voice before pressing the comm unit again. Command, confirm identity of the incoming officer, he asked, but the response did not come immediately. Instead, there was only the low hum of encrypted transmission, the kind that meant the answer was already moving faster than protocol allowed him to track. Beside him, one of the younger guards shifted his weight, eyes flicking between Hayes and the screen, uncertain whether to remain rigid or step back, caught between training and instinct. Hayes, however, remained exactly where he had been from the moment he arrived, the folded map now resting calmly in his hand, his posture unchanged, his presence quiet but undeniable, not demanding attention, not avoiding it either, simply existing in a way that made the structure around him feel temporary. Carter found himself watching him more closely now, noticing details he had dismissed before, the way his shoulders stayed relaxed even as the situation escalated, the way his gaze moved not randomly but with intention, briefly scanning the perimeter, the towers, the angles of approach, like someone measuring distances without needing tools, and that realization unsettled him more than any direct threat could have, because it suggested familiarity, not guesswork. The comm unit finally came alive again, but instead of clarification it delivered something else entirely. Lieutenant, stand down from identification protocol. The voice said, firm, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation. Carter's jaw tightened. Sir, with respect, I have an unidentified individual inside a restricted zone, he replied, choosing his words carefully, still holding on to procedure like it was the only solid ground left. There was a brief pause. Then the response came sharper. You have an identified individual, Lieutenant. You just do not recognize him. The words landed with precision, cutting through Carter's remaining assumptions in a way that left no space for argument. He lowered his hand slowly, eyes drifting back to Hayes. And for the first time since the encounter began, he did not see a civilian out of place. He saw a gap in his own understanding, a piece of the system that existed beyond his clearance, beyond his training. Behind them, the gate mechanism emitted a soft mechanical sound, a signal that should not have triggered without manual authorization. Yet the reinforced barrier began to unlock, the heavy bolts retracting with a low metallic echo that carried across the checkpoint. Carter turned instinctively toward it, confusion flashing across his face before discipline pulled it back into place. Who authorized that? He asked, more to himself than anyone else. But no one answered, because the answer was already evident in the way the system was responding. Not to Carter, not to the guards, but to the man standing quietly in front of them. Hayes did not move immediately. He did not step forward the moment the path opened. Instead, he waited, just long enough to make it clear that he was not following the system. The system was aligning with him, and when he finally took a step toward the now open gate, it was not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate, like someone walking into a place that had always been his. Carter felt something shift inside him again, Not quite respect yet, but something moving in that direction, something that made him step slightly to the side without being told, creating space where moments ago there had only been resistance. And as Hayes passed him, close enough that Carter could hear the faint rustle of the folded map against fabric, the old man spoke one more time, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the opening gate. "Systems change," he said, not looking at Carter. "But ground truth does not." And then he continued forward, leaving Carter standing at the threshold between what he knew and what he had just begun to question. The moment Hayes crossed the threshold, the atmosphere inside the perimeter shifted in a way that no protocol manual could describe, not because alarms were sounding or personnel were scrambling, but because everything continued as normal with just enough precision to feel intentional, as if the base itself was aware of his presence and had chosen not to interrupt its rhythm. The hum of generators remained steady. The distant rotation of radar arrays continued their slow, deliberate sweep across the horizon, and yet every movement now carried an undercurrent of awareness, subtle glances from passing personnel, a slight pause in conversations that resumed just a fraction too late. Hayes walked along the concrete path without hesitation, his pace unhurried, his gaze steady, not searching for direction but confirming it, as if each turn had already been mapped long before the buildings around him had ever been constructed. Behind him, just inside the gate, Lieutenant Carter remained still for a moment longer than necessary, watching the old man move deeper into a space Carter himself had never been cleared to enter, the realization settling in layers, first confusion, then resistance, and finally something quieter, something closer to acceptance, though he did not yet have the language for it. A sharp voice broke through his thoughts from the checkpoint console. "Lieutenant, you are ordered to accompany." Carter turned immediately, instinct snapping back into place. "Accompany who?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Mr. Hayes." The voice replied, calm but firm. "Maintain distance, do not interfere." Carter nodded once, more to himself than anyone else, then stepped forward, crossing the line he had enforced moments ago. The transition was not marked by any visible barrier, but he felt it nonetheless, like stepping into a different layer of the same reality, one where the rules were still present but not entirely his to enforce. He moved at a measured pace, keeping several yards behind Hayes, observing now instead of directing, and as he did, he began to notice things that had always been there but had never demanded his attention. The way Hayes adjusted his path slightly to account for a blind corner before reaching it. The brief glance he gave to his sensor tower not as curiosity, but as recognition. Even the way his steps slowed near a section of the perimeter wall where the concrete changed tone ever so slightly. A detail Carter had walked past dozens of times without a second thought. "You have been here before," Carter said finally, the words leaving his mouth before he had fully decided to speak. Hayes did not turn, but his answer came just as steadily as before. "Before it was finished," he said, and that simple clarification carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have. Carter's eyes moved to the structures around them, seeing them now not as permanent fixtures, but as layers built over something older, something less visible, but still present. Ahead of them the path curved toward a secured inner access point, a reinforced door set into a low structure partially embedded into the ground, its surface smooth, unmarked, designed not to attract attention. Hayes approached it without slowing, and before he reached for anything, before he presented any form of identification, the door responded, a soft click followed by a controlled release of pressure as it opened inward, silent except for the faint movement of sealed mechanisms disengaging. Carter stopped a few steps back, his training pulling against what he was witnessing. Every secure entry he knew required authentication, verification, confirmation, and yet this door had opened without any visible input, without hesitation, as if it had been waiting. Hayes paused at the threshold, not out of uncertainty but acknowledgement, his hand briefly touching the surface near the frame, fingers brushing against the metal in a way that was almost familiar, almost personal, and for a fleeting second, something shifted in his expression, not visible enough to define, but present enough to feel, like a memory passing through without needing to be spoken. Carter watched closely, every instinct telling him that he was seeing something important without understanding it. The comm unit remained silent now. No further instructions, no corrections, just the quiet implication that whatever was happening was proceeding exactly as intended. Hayes stepped inside without looking back, disappearing into the dim interior beyond the door, and Carter stood there at the edge, the boundary no longer defined by barriers or clearance levels, but by how much of this he was ready to accept. And after a brief moment that felt longer than it should have, he followed. The interior beyond the door was cooler, quieter, the air carrying a faint metallic scent mixed with something older, something that did not belong to modern construction. The lighting was subdued, recessed strips along the ceiling casting a steady white glow that left no shadows deep enough to hide in. And yet the space felt layered, like it had been built over itself more than once. Lieutenant Carter stepped in just behind Hayes, the door sealing softly behind them with a controlled precision that echoed down the corridor, a sound that marked the boundary between what Carter knew and what he was about to learn. He slowed his pace instinctively, his eyes adjusting not to the light, but to the details. The walls were smooth, but not uniform. Subtle variations in the surface hinted at older materials beneath the newer finish, panels that had been replaced, reinforced, updated, but never entirely erased. Hayes moved forward without hesitation, his steps measured, his posture unchanged, as if he did not need to study the environment because it already existed somewhere in his memory. Carter watched closely, noting how Hayes did not look for signage, did not pause at intersections. He simply followed a path that seemed invisible to anyone else, and that realization settled deeper than any command Carter had received. This was not access granted. This was familiarity returning. They passed a series of sealed doors, each marked only by small alphanumeric codes that meant nothing without clearance. Yet Hayes's gaze flicked to them briefly, not reading, recognizing, like a man walking past old landmarks that no longer needed names. Carter felt a question forming again, but this time it stayed unspoken, replaced by observation, by the growing awareness that speaking too soon might break something he was only beginning to understand. Ahead, the corridor widened slightly, opening into a larger chamber where the ceiling rose higher and the air felt stiller. At the far end stood a reinforced glass partition. Beyond it, a room filled with equipment Carter could not fully identify, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it did not match any single system he had been trained on. It looked like a convergence of old and new, analog interfaces beside digital panels, physical switches next to touch screens, as if the room itself had evolved without ever discarding its origins. Hayes slowed as he approached the glass, his reflection faintly visible against the surface, and for the first time since Carter had seen him, there was a pause, not uncertainty, but acknowledgement. His hand moved slightly, not reaching out, just hovering near the glass as if measuring distance. Without touching it, Carter stopped a few steps behind, his breath steady but his thoughts no longer aligned with protocol. "What is this place?" he asked quietly, the question no longer driven by authority but by the need to understand. Hayes did not turn, his eyes fixed on the room beyond, and when he spoke, his voice carried that same low, grounded tone. "This is where it started," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any classified briefing Carter had ever received. Behind them, footsteps approached, controlled, deliberate, not rushed but purposeful, the kind of movement that did not need to announce itself to be recognized. Carter turned instinctively, his posture straightening before he even saw who it was. A senior officer entered the chamber, uniform immaculate, presence steady, the kind of authority that shifted a room without effort. Captain Lewis, the same officer who had initiated the call chain. His eyes moved first to Hayes, not to Carter, not to the room, but directly to the old man. And in that brief exchange, something passed between them, not spoken, not formal, just recognition. Lewis came to a stop a few feet away, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of respect that Carter had not heard before. "Sir," he said, addressing Hayes, not as a civilian, not as a visitor, but as something else entirely, something that did not fit into Carter's understanding of rank or role. Hayes inclined his head slightly, a small acknowledgement, nothing more, and in that moment Carter understood something without being told. The system had not granted access to Robert Hayes. It had remembered him, and everything that followed was not an exception, it was a correction. Captain Lewis did not rush his next words, and that restraint carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. His posture remained straight but not rigid, his eyes steady on Hayes as if confirming something long expected rather than reacting to something unexpected. "We have been monitoring the alerts since you entered the outer perimeter," he said, his tone controlled, measured, each word placed with intent. "The system flagged inconsistencies we could not initially explain." Hayes gave a slight nod, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging the statement as fact, his gaze shifting once more to the room beyond the glass, the layered equipment reflecting faintly in his eyes. Carter remained silent behind them, but his attention sharpened, every instinct telling him that whatever explanation was coming would redefine everything he thought he understood about the facility. Lewis stepped slightly closer to the glass partition, positioning himself just off Hayes' shoulder, not in front, not leading, but aligning, a subtle detail that did not go unnoticed. This section was never meant to be permanent, Lewis continued, his voice lowering slightly, not for secrecy but for weight. It was designed as a prototype, a foundation for something that would evolve beyond its original parameters. Carter's eyes moved across the room again, taking in the blend of systems, the coexistence of old interfaces and modern controls. And for the first time, he did not see inconsistency. He saw continuity. Hayes finally spoke again, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty. "You built over it," he said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating what had already been done. Lewis inclined his head slightly. "Yes, sir, we expanded, upgraded, integrated new systems, but we never fully replaced the core." There was a brief pause, the kind that allowed meaning to settle rather than be rushed past. "Because we could not." That last part landed differently, not as limitation but as recognition. Carter felt a subtle shift inside him. The idea that something in this facility had remained untouched not out of neglect but necessity. Hayes' hand moved again, this time resting lightly against the glass, his fingers tracing a faint line that was invisible to Carter but clearly defined to him. And in that motion something deeper surfaced, not a full memory, not a visible reaction, just a quiet alignment between past and present. Lewis noticed it, his expression tightening slightly with understanding. "The coordinates you carry," he said carefully. "They match the original layout, not the current one." Hayes nodded once. "Because the ground did not change," he replied, and that answer carried more than geography. Carter felt it without fully grasping it. The idea that beneath every system, every update, every layer of technology, there was something fixed, something that could not be rewritten. The comm unit on Carter's shoulder remained silent now. No interruptions, no corrections. Just the steady hum of a situation unfolding exactly as it should. Lewis took a slow breath, then straightened slightly, his next words carrying a different weight, one that extended beyond explanation. "Sir, there is someone who needs to see you," he said, and even before the words were finished, the atmosphere in the room shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that Carter felt it, a subtle tightening, a quiet anticipation. Hayes did not ask who, did not question why. He simply lowered his hand from the glass and turned, his movements deliberate, controlled, as if he already understood what was coming next. Footsteps echoed faintly from the corridor behind them, not hurried, not heavy, but precise, each step measured, carrying authority that did not need to announce itself. Carter turned instinctively, his posture straightening before his mind fully caught up, and in that moment he realized that everything up to now had not been the climax. It had been the preparation. The system had not just recognized Hayes, it had escalated him. And whatever was about to step into that room would not be there to question him. It would be there to acknowledge him. The footsteps reached the threshold and stopped, not abruptly, but with the kind of control that defines someone who never needed to hurry. And when the figure entered the room, the atmosphere did not explode into motion or sound. It narrowed, focused, as if every detail suddenly aligned around a single point of gravity. General Whitaker carried himself with the quiet authority of a man whose presence had shaped decisions far beyond this room. His uniform precise, his gaze sharp, but not searching, because the moment he stepped inside, he already knew exactly who he was looking at. His eyes met Hayes without hesitation, and for a brief second, nothing else existed in that space. Not Carter, not Lewis, not the systems humming quietly behind reinforced glass. Just recognition, unspoken and complete. Carter felt it before he understood it. The shift in hierarchy happening without a word, without an order, without any visible exchange of rank. Whitaker took 2 measured steps forward, stopping at a respectful distance, not close enough to impose, not far enough to disengage. And then, in a movement so controlled it almost seemed simple, he raised his hand in a formal salute. Not exaggerated, not ceremonial, just precise, exact, the kind of salute that carried meaning because it was never given lightly. The room did not react immediately. But the silence that followed deepened, stretching just long enough for the weight of the gesture to settle into every person present. Captain Lewis straightened instinctively, his own posture aligning with the moment. Carter stood completely still, his training recognizing the form of the salute, but his mind struggling to reconcile why it was being given and to whom. Hayes did not return it right away, not out of hesitation, but out of something older, something that did not respond to protocol on command. His eyes held Whitaker's for a second longer. Then he gave a small nod, not formal, not dismissive, just acknowledgement, and only then did he raise his hand, slower, steadier, returning the salute in a way that felt less like procedure and more like closure. Whitaker lowered his hand first, as if he had been the one asking for permission, not granting it. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the command Carter had expected, only respect. "Sir," he said, the single word clear, deliberate, leaving no ambiguity about how he viewed the man in front of him. Carter felt something shift fully inside him then, not confusion anymore, not resistance, but understanding beginning to take shape. The system had not malfunctioned, it had deferred. Everything from the alerts to the gate to the unlocked doors had not been errors. They had been corrections aligning the present with something that had always been there beneath it. Hayes lowered his hand completely, his posture unchanged, his voice quiet as ever. "You built a lot on top of it," he said, glancing briefly toward the glass partition. Whitaker followed his gaze, then nodded once. "We had to," he replied. "But we never replaced what mattered." There was no pride in the statement, only recognition. Hayes looked back at him, and for a moment there was a trace of something almost like approval, not given freely, not spoken, just present. Carter stood at the edge of it all, no longer part of the confrontation that had started this, but not entirely outside it either. His earlier certainty about systems, protocols, and authority now reframed by what he had witnessed. He thought about the gate, the scan that returned nothing, the map that should not have existed, and the way every layer of the base had responded not to data, but to a man it could not catalog. Whitaker took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space. "We have kept it operational," he said, "exactly as it was designed." Hayes gave a slight nod, his hand resting once more on the folded map. "Then it still works," he replied. And there was something final in the way he said it. Not a question, not a test, just a confirmation. The room remained quiet after that. No orders given, no movement required, because the moment had already resolved itself. Carter exhaled slowly, not realizing he had been holding his breath, his eyes moving once more between Hayes and Whitaker, and for the first time since this began, he understood that respect was not assigned by rank or granted by systems. It was recognized when something real stood in front of you, something that had already proven itself long before you arrived. And as the silence settled into something steadier, something almost calm, one truth remained clear in a way Carter would not forget. Systems can define access, but they do not define worth.